Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar titled Securing Application Access and Why Auditors Love GRC. This session is sponsored by Savient. As this is a live event, please be aware of potential connectivity issues that could arise with our speaker. Please note today our speaker will not be on camera during his presentation, but he will be here the entire duration and we still look forward to a wonderful event. As a reminder, the attendee chat is intended for education and connection purposes. As always, we ask that you keep the chat kind and respectful. We have a great speaker here with us today, JD Bell. JD is Senior Solution Engineer at Savient. He is a proven technology architect and solution delivery leader with a successful track record in providing customer-trusted advisory expertise around cybersecurity, identity management, and GRC initiatives. Specialized focus areas include enterprise identity frameworks, governance solution architectures, application security, and secure access management. To learn more about JD, please check out the speaker window to the right of your console. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to JD to get us started. JD, you may begin.
Thanks, Kara. Hello, everyone. As Kara said, my name is JD Bell. I'm with Savient. My voice may sound a little hoarse today. I'm a little under the weather, but we should be able to get through this very successfully, I'm sure. So again, governance, risk, and compliance, why auditors love it. So we're going to touch on a lot of characteristics of GRC, but I kind of want to start with the basics. Governance in a compliance-driven world, I want to start with what GRC really is. So first, what does it stand for? Obviously, it stands for governance, risk, and compliance. And while most businesses are familiar with these terms, they have routinely practiced them separately in the past. GRC really combines governance, risk management, and compliance in one, hopefully, coordinated model. This helps your company reduce waste, increase efficiency, and reduce risk across the enterprise. So let's talk on the three pillars real quickly, just to make sure we go into this with a clear understanding of what GRC really means. So G, governance. Governance really is the set of policies, rules, and frameworks that a company uses to achieve its business goals. It defines the responsibilities of key stakeholders, people like the board of directors, senior management, all the players in the organization that are responsible for maintaining those policy, rules, and frameworks. An effective governance approach really typically includes things like ethics and accountability, transparency in the sharing of information, and then policies around conflict resolutions, things like escalation paths, how those things are handled routinely within the organization. And finally, resource management policies and controls. And in this context, resources can include employees, third parties, but it also includes the systems and information that that organization maintains in any form. Second pillar, risk. Businesses really face different types of risk, including financial, strategic, legal, security risk. Proper risk management helps businesses identify these risks and, most importantly, find ways to mitigate and remediate any that are found. Third pillar, compliance. Compliance is really the act of following rules, laws, and regulations. It applies to legal and regulatory requirements typically set by industrial bodies and also for internal corporate policies. In the world of GRC, compliance really involves implementing procedures to ensure that businesses and their activities comply with respective regulations. So healthcare companies pay a lot of attention to things like HIPAA. Any company using credit card transactions and things, they pay a real attention to PCI regulations. So it's compliance really comes down to what does your industry dictate that you have to follow from a regulatory standpoint, and also what are you doing internally around that. All right, so that kind of covers governance, risk, and compliance. Now, the other aspect of our presentation today is around application access governance, and you're going to find how closely these two are married in a typical organization. So what is application access governance? It really is about the strategies and controls an organization has to provide visibility into identities and access privileges. We'll get into a lot of detail around what that really means as we get further into the presentation. Application access governance is also very much compliance driven as well. You have, regulations like SOX. I mentioned HIPAA, GDPR for our European, organizations and such. So a lot of the stuff that is done around application access governance is really focused on compliance and making sure that you're adherent to whatever specific regulations you might be subject to. But it's also very much security driven. We've seen a lot of stories in the news around things like account abuse, lateral movements within an organization. So identity and application access governance is really focused on putting controls and such in place to limit those kind of activities from happening. It's kind of keeping bad actors out of your organization. It's also all about detecting and preventing inappropriate access. So when you talk about access within an organization, I'm a new employee. I get my initial access based on what my role is, based on what my department is, or whatever it may be that dictates what I get day one. But as I potentially move through that organization, changing jobs and stuff, what we see with most organizations is they don't do a very good job of removing the access I previously had and ensuring that I only have the access I need to do my current job. And we'll touch a little bit more on that. It kind of revolves around the principle of least privilege and so on. And then when you talk about application access governance, the processes and the solutions typically live on top of an identity governance and administration platform. That's where you get all the tooling and the plumbing around provisioning and stuff. That's really where it typically takes place. So let's change slides here. All right, still, let's talk about the convergence of GRC and access governance. I will start with saying that a key thing to remember about GRC is that by implementing GRC programs, organizations can really make better decisions in a risk-aware environment. You have to have that visibility into the risk that's associated with your organization. An effective GRC program really helps the key stakeholders set policies, really from a shared perspective across the organization, and helps them comply with regulatory requirements. With GRC, the entire company comes together in its policies, decisions, and actions. Now, what we're seeing, it's been more recent in the last several years, is that things like GRC and access governance aren't being driven by IT. They're really being driven now by the C-levels in the organization, whether it's the CFO, the CIO, CTO, in combination with their internal audit organizations and compliance. So again, these activities have kind of moved out of the IT space where they were typically getting buried into getting a lot more focus at the higher levels of the organization. And when you talk about bringing GRC and into an access governance model, you're really talking about things like segregation of duties. We're going to go into a lot of detail around segregation of duties, but just as a brief intro, segregation of duties means that I shouldn't have the ability, again, to do more than what my job requires. And by the way, I probably shouldn't have anything that might be deemed a toxic combination of permissions. So for example, if I'm an accountant in an organization and I have the ability to generate invoices, chances are I shouldn't also have the ability of approving invoices. If I can generate an invoice and approve it myself, that can lead to a lot of bad behavior. A lot of the downfalls of companies like Enron and stuff like that involve that kind of segregation of duty misbehavior, so to speak. So when we talk about segregation of duties, we're talking about, again, toxic permissions of entitlements and stuff. And we're talking about the concept of rule sets. We're talking about analysis and remediation. We're talking about the ability to manage segregation of duties in your organization, because every organization has kind of a unique take on their roles and permissions. And we're talking about, even more critically, around the mitigating controls that an organization will need to put in place to make sure that those segregation of duties are being managed appropriately. There's a strong audit focus around application access governance as well when you talk about the GRC perspective. And that focus from an audit perspective is typically on sensitive or critical access. So in other words, sensitive data, we'll go into what kind of differentiates between sensitive data and segregation of duties violations, but the audits typically focus on that aspect. A real key around segregation of duties, maintenance, and making sure it's effective, is that you have to have cross-application segregations of duties analysis. And we're going to touch on where that comes into play just as a brief intro. When most organizations talk about providing segregation of duties controls, it's usually a tool that is focused on a single platform. So, for example, SAP has an SAP GRC module that provides GRC controls within SAP. And that's all well and good and great. But if I've got other applications that are just as critical and there aren't those same segregation of duty controls, then I'm still leaving myself very exposed. And then when you talk about GRC and the access governance process, it's got to be a seamless integration into all your governance processes. This includes things like preventative checks and stuff. So this gets into the area of access lifecycle management. So you want the ability to surface risk around access requests. So if I'm requesting access to a new application and I'm requesting, let's call it risky access. Maybe I'm requesting God mode within that application, a high level admin access. Chances are you want to surface the fact that I'm making a request for a highly risky entitlement or permission, and you want that to be surfaced to the approver of that request as well, so that they know exactly what they're approving or not approving. You just have to have that visibility into the risk around access requests, and then around certifications. We're going to talk about a little bit, what certifications mean in the GRC world, but access certifications essentially are every organization has some requirement around audit certifications, access reviews, whatever you want to call them. Those access reviews typically show what a user has access to. So if I'm a manager and I have a set of employees, I will typically receive a certification where I, number one, have to recertify that those employees still work for me. And two, I have to certify and agree that the permissions they currently have are appropriate or not. I can make decisions not, to say that they don't need those permissions, but that's what essentially an access review really is. One. So let's talk about the traditional approach to application access governance. And this is really before GRC became such a big component within application access. But the typical approach around application access governance was really focused on automation and efficiency. So I had my application owners. They were kind of siloed. They were responsible for their own applications. And they were responsible for setting rules around who got access to what within those applications. So it was really geared towards provisioning, deprovisioning, and those types of activities. What you find is, we touched on, how GRC solutions are typically point focused. You can't just rely on a points GRC solution for a single ERP application, for example, like an SAP GRC. You're just leaving yourself exposed for all your, with all your other applications in your organization. And basically what people used to think that compliance, if you were compliant, that kind of equaled security. But that's not really the case. Compliance doesn't equal security because you don't have that visibility into the risk, the ongoing risk that is, around applications and such in your organization. Basically, when we've got a world now that is moving heavily into the cloud model. A lot of organizations are adopting SaaS. Whether it's ServiceNow, Workday, any of the number of SaaS platforms that have become very popular. But unfortunately, securing access to those applications really hasn't moved past single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. Those are kind of the table stakes. But when you talk about securing access to those cloud applications, you really have to go a lot deeper and get a lot more granular as far as who has access to what. What we find today, have found historically, I should say, is that the automation of provisioning is really too coarse-grained in most applications. And what does that mean? It means that I have an application. I'm just going to stick with SAP. So I create a role in SAP that has certain permissions associated with it within SAP. I say that all my accountants get this role the day they start. Well, chances are that all my accountant personnel don't need all the permissions associated with that role. That role is essentially too coarse-grained. So what we're seeing now is that organizations are taking a much more granular approach in creating roles and assigning permissions to users. And failed audits, that's typically been the case when you talk about applications, because GRC and IAM, or identity and access management, are typically siloed practices, not just within IT, but also across an organization. So that's kind of the traditional approach to application access governance, what we've seen in the past. So let's talk about the traditional approach to GRC. How have organizations historically approached governance, risk, and compliance? Basically, as I mentioned, because when you talk about applications, it's typically we're talking about segregation of duties, as I highlighted. So again, organizations have historically been focused on specific ERP technologies. They've only worried about securing those critical financial applications like an SAP and Oracle and so on, when you really need to expand that view of risk across your other applications as well. Typically, integration of GRC tools with IDM platforms, it's been complex. So when customers have had a lot of legacy identity management type platforms, you've had the IBMs, the CAs of the world, and so on. Well, integrating GRC tools with those platforms was notoriously difficult. The world's changing there, but again, historically, it was hard to do. And most large enterprises really just implement GRC technologies to meet compliance requirements. And again, typically only for those critical financial applications. So it's never enough to just do something because you have to, and I'll get into why as we get towards the end, why that's just a bad practice. You have to really focus around the ongoing management of risk as well, not just focus on audits and such. Again, we've talked about how the traditional approach to GRC has been focused around segregation of duties analysis for specific applications, and it's been difficult historically to get that visibility and governance for other applications. But you have to bring those other applications into the mix. I'll use an example. Most organizations have an Active Directory or two in their infrastructure. You can have very high privileged Active Directory groups that, if I as an employee have access to a couple of those groups, maybe that gives me too much power around, different applications. So again, segregation of duties extends way beyond just those ERP applications, but it extends into other portions of the enterprise as well. Legacy on-prem models with most GRC vendors, that they have been legacy, and they are having a very difficult time adapting to the cloud. So we're starting to see some of the new technologies come out. I currently work for one that provides a great cloud-based capability in that arena. But yeah, legacy, typically on-prem, those tools are just having a very difficult time adapting to the different, frameworks that the cloud brings to the table. So we've talked about the traditional approach to application access governance, the traditional approach to GRC. Let's talk about how we bring them together. So again, I can't emphasize this enough. Again, it's got to, when you talk about an effective approach of marrying GRC and application access governance, it's really got to be focused on visibility and governance. Why visibility? Because you can't manage what you can't see. I mean, at the end of the day, visibility is really key. Automated provisioning with risk-based approvals and certifications. We touched on that briefly. When I'm getting my users provisioned to applications and giving them entitlements within those applications, I want to know if that user is requesting something that's too risky. I want to be able to surface the fact that that's a risky access request, and then I can make informed decisions on whether I approve or don't approve that request. Again, sending governance to cloud apps, it's getting better. But when you talk about those SaaS applications like Workday, Salesforce, and so on, it's just been very difficult to bring those applications into an effective GRC model. But again, platforms are evolving, and it is now becoming much more easy to do that. It's just a conversation we have with organizations all the time that are used to that on-premise type of functionality and are struggling to get their hands around their cloud applications. It's just a real must-have for them. Risk-based approach that incorporates segregation of duties, sensitive access, outlier access, and control violations that can trigger actions. I mean, that's really key. So we're talking about how we bring GRC and application access together. You're seeing components here around application access governance, but when you start mixing in the segregation of duties capabilities and being able to monitor them, report on them, remediate them as needed, that's where you're starting to bring that GRC framework into place. Let's see if there's anything else here that's worth bringing up. You could talk about automated provisioning and leveraging a combination of role and attribute-based access control models. What we are seeing is many organizations are trying to move to that role-based access for their organizations. Why? Because it gets very difficult to not manage via roles. So, roles just give companies an effective way to try to adhere to that, quote, principle of least privilege, where any given user only has the entitlements they need to do their job. All right, let's keep moving. All right, are you exposed? Let's ask an auditor. These days, in addition to being incorporated into larger scale audits focusing on IT and the business, GRC audits are really now being conducted on a more focused and dedicated basis. So when auditors used to talk about governance, risk, and compliance, it was typically in the context of a larger scale audit. But now, again, there are dedicated audits being dedicated to GRC. So what really is a GRC audit? A GRC audit really evaluates the effectiveness of an organization's governance, risk management, and compliance infrastructure. I mean, with the help of a GRC audit, you can identify gaps in the implementation of controls, for example, that are dictated by an IT security policy. You can manage data privacy and security risk by identifying threats earlier in their life cycle. That's really key these days. Data privacy is a huge topic of conversation across the world. Different countries have different, frameworks around what they require around data privacy. You have to be able to show your auditors, that you're managing data privacy appropriately. And then you've got to remain compliant with your regulatory frameworks, and you've got to keep your sensitive data safe. Typically, even when your cybersecurity controls seem to function as expected, a GRC audit will typically reveal potential gaps that might pose, data security risk, process security risk, and so on. So let's talk about what an auditor typically looks for when they're coming in to conduct a GRC type of audit across your organization. And this is specifically related to applications when they're focused on the application aspects of your organization. So I like to bucket these into three types: proactive measures, active measures, and reactive measures. So let's talk proactive measures. How are identities identified and where are they stored? Are you using an identity store, an IGA platform? I mean, we see a lot of organizations that rely on Active Directory, for example, as their identity store. Not a lot of controls around Active Directory typically, unless you build them yourself. So that's why we see most organizations trying to move into an identity governance and administration platform where you get a lot of more robust capabilities around the management of those identities, the reporting, and the ongoing monitoring of the risk associated with those identities. Another proactive measure, managing authentication and authorization controls. This is kind of where single sign-on could typically come into play, but there are a lot more controls that are typically needed. Basically, managing authentication and authorization means, who am I? What can I see and do? And then the support, again, for the principle of least privilege. Again, that's key for any organization, and that's key for what any auditor is going to look for. What kind of controls and what kind of processes do you have in place to work towards that goal of principle of least privilege for all your employees and partners or anybody else that you're maintaining in your organization? Again, the principle of least privilege tells me that I only have the ability to do what I need to do my job and nothing more. All right, those are the proactive measures. That's the stuff you can do during planning and design. That's the stuff you can put in place ahead of time. Now, what about the active measures? Okay, so what's an auditor looking for there? Auditor's looking for, what are your logging controls? What are your logging platforms? I mean, what are you capturing? How long are you keeping it? How is it reviewed? And what kind of remediation is fed, it comes about as a result of those logs? You've got to have a good program for correlation and alerting across the enterprise. You can't treat your applications like they're in a silo. You have to have, I'd call it a higher level of visibility and monitoring across your applications that provide correlations of events. So you think of something like a Splunk, SIMS, Security Information Event models, platforms. They do a great job of correlating events across applications. So if I see somebody's trying to hack into one of my routers, and I also see that same IP trying to access one of my applications, the chances are I can use that as that correlation to say, hey, it looks like this person got past my router and now they're trying to hack into my application. And then the other active measure the auditors could be looking for is, are you doing timely application provisioning and deprovisioning? Are your users getting access to what they need in a timely manner? But even more importantly, is that access being taken away upon termination, upon job change, maybe when they go on a leave of absence? You want to maintain a strict set of controls around who has access to what, so you're not leaving. You don't have users that have more access than they need, and you don't have accounts out there that aren't being used. Next, we talk about reactive measures, compliance adherence. That's kind of what the auditors are focusing on when they talk about the reactive measures. How are you managing to the regulations you're subject to, whether it's GDPR, SOX, and so on? So auditors will do a kind of point in time report on how you're adhering to the particular regulations you're subject to. Mitigating controls. What mitigating controls do you have in place to mitigate risk, to mitigate segregation of duties violations? So, for example, I've got an employee who leaves my organization. I've got another employee that has to assume that employee's role in addition to the one they currently have until we can hire somebody else. So for a temporary period of time, that employee is going to have more permissions than they need because they're essentially going to be doing two jobs. Well, that's okay, as long as you recognize that. The trick is an auditor is going to look for mitigating controls around that. Now, what a typical mitigating control around that is you have a time-bound access for that second set of permissions. So I know I'm going to have somebody new in that job in 2 weeks. So I have put time-bound access around that my current employee's ability to do that second role. That's what's considered a mitigating control. And then they're going to look at what you're doing around incident responses, because trust me, people, it's not if, but when something's going to happen that requires an incident response of some type. So they're going to be looking at your incident response capabilities and processes around applications and around, all your platforms, your networks, your applications, and everything, actually. All right. Application access governance, as I alluded to earlier, is really growing in importance. Basically, and these are some dated numbers. I think these could probably be increased at this point. The average cost of a data breach it's over $4.5 million right now. So this is a little bit of a dated number, but I will tell you it's over $4.5 million based on some recent incidents. 80% of data breaches involve access, misuse, or compromise. When you talk about data breaches, you talk about Target, all the stuff we've read in the papers. Most of those breaches have taken place as a result of somebody coming in and getting an unused account that the organization wasn't even aware was still out there, and then using that account to kind of get into more admin types of accounts. So the misuse of access is one of the key causes of most data breaches. These days, and I think this number is higher as well, on average, companies use 34 SaaS apps in their enterprise. I'd say that number is probably higher now. This is a year or so old, because we see most organizations are moving to those cloud apps because of the efficiencies and the cost savings around offloading those capabilities into a cloud environment. So whether it's a ServiceNow, a Salesforce, a Splunk, whatever it might be, companies are moving to that model. So application access governance becomes increasingly important because now you're moving into a cloud model where access really needs to be controlled. Companies got very comfortable with on-premise applications because they had control over their network. They had control who was inside their network. They had direct control over who accessed their applications. With a cloud model, it becomes a little more convoluted, a little more open door, so to speak. I like the phrase. It's kind of almost a cliche now, but they used to say networks were your perimeter for an organization. Now identity is the new perimeter because those identities live a lot of different places, both on-prem, in the cloud, and so on. 50% of cloud security failures are due to inadequate management of identity and privileges. Kind of ties back to what I was saying. It's a different model. Organizations have to get a handle on that new model and how to best manage access and such within those applications. Because again, based on, hey, they're talking to the internet, theoretically, everybody has access to it at some level. So they're a lot more subject to bad actors coming in and trying to do bad things. 94% of companies use some form of cloud SaaS. So again, just kind of reiterates what I was saying, that SaaS cloud is a growing model and more companies are moving towards it. Excuse me, I got to take a sip of water. All right. We talked about segregation of duties. And we talked about, how you really need to be able to apply management segregations of duties across the organization. You can't just rely on doing that in a single application like an SAP or an Oracle. But there are challenges to trying to adopt a cross-application governance model. Basically, you're dealing with unique security models. Different applications have different security models. So you have to somehow be able to construct some tools and processes that can kind of bridge the gap between those security models. And that really requires specialized skills to manage, not only across the applications, but within each application as well. So again, most organizations historically, they've had an application. They have that application owner that kind of knows everything about that application. The organization becomes heavily dependent on that application owner. And by the way, if that application owner ever gets hit by a buzz, they're kind of in a bad spot because nobody really knows what's going on in that application. You really have to get away from that model and start, getting that knowledge more, I guess, propagated through the organization around that application. And again, with those unique security models, it's very difficult to aggregate compliance information. You get different types of reports from those applications that somehow you have to consolidate and put into something that an auditor can digest effectively. Another challenge is the limited visibility of segregation of duties risk. Again, we talked about coarse-grained versus fine-grained visibility. Coarse-grained, as I kind of alluded to, it really only shows part of the picture. You really need to get deeper into an application to the fine-grained entitlements to get an effective picture of what your potential segregation of duties risk might be. Roles, again, organizations typically adopt very coarse-grained roles because it's easier just to say, I'm going to put all these users into this one bucket, when probably half the users don't need all the permissions associated with that role. But it's very difficult to surface that if you're relying on those coarse-grained roles, coarse-grained entitlements, and so on. And then it just results in identifying risk across applications is almost impossible because you're not deep enough to see what's going on under the covers of those roles that you may have created. Risk analysis is limited. There's a lack of predictive signals, and that kind of gets back to what I was saying is, when you're talking about lifecycle management around access management, you're talking about, again, providing that predictive risk capability. If I'm making a request for access, I as an organization, I want any risk associated with that request. Again, maybe I'm asking for, again, that toxic permission or toxic combination of permissions that I shouldn't have, or maybe I'm asking for access to sensitive data. You've got to have an ability to surface that before that request is even granted. An approver should see that. Maybe it should be escalated based on the nature of the request. So what you're finding is platforms are adopting to this model by providing those types of escalation capabilities and such. Limited mitigating controls. Again, yeah, mitigating controls are important. I gave an example of how a time-bound access could potentially be used as a mitigating control. But there are other types of mitigating controls that organizations need to be looking at to be able to effectively manage SODs across applications. All right, so here are the three key pillars for in my mind represents an effective identity approach. Now, when I say identity approach, this includes application access governance. This includes incorporating GRC type controls into that application access governance, but it really focuses on three things. Visibility is key, and I think I've said this before. You can't manage what you can't see. You have to have that broad and deep visibility across all your on-premise and your SaaS applications. Again, a lot of things come into play there. Number one, you need to manage risk around segregation of duties, around sensitive data access, not just at a point basis within applications, but across all your applications. So visibility is key. Governance. I mean, we've talked about what governance really is, but you've got to design access, and this becomes governance as well as it affects a lot of things. You've got to design access policies, processes, and have your platforms, whatever supporting tools you're using, really strive for that access based on least privilege. Again, I know I've said it before, but it's about any given user not having more access than they need to do their job. And you've got to uniformly apply those application access policies across all of the applications. And then you've got security. You've got to balance real-time risk and risk-based access. And the key there is you've got to have the controls in place around the GR. We talked about some of the controls before, but you've got to have those controls around security. It covers everything from the risk-based access we talked about. It covers certification reviews. You've got to have the security aspects involved as well to have any kind of effective identity management program. All right, so let's talk about the typical steps for implementing an application access risk management program. Again, when I say application access risk management, that again gets back to that marriage of GRC with application access governance. Three basic steps. First one, and this is probably the most important one, is get clean. You've heard the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. That kind of comes into play here. So you really want to do an effective analysis of your organization. You want to catalog your applications. You want to catalog your roles. You want to catalog everything you're currently using so that you have an effective view on what's going on in the organization, and you have the ability to go in, do analysis, and clean it up appropriately. I will tell you, coming from a background of implementing identity governance and administration platforms, that very rarely do I come into an organization that's new to IGA and has decided to purchase a platform that there isn't work they need to do ahead of that implementation. They need to get their user base cleaned up. All their users being stored in a common identity store. Are attributes associated with those users kind of common? Do they have the ability to report on that stuff? What are the roles that they currently have? Well, let me take a step back. What are the applications they currently have? What are the roles being maintained in those applications? Are those roles appropriate, or maybe we need to do some trimming of those roles or retooling of those roles to try to get to that more fine-grained approach to access that I was outlining earlier. That kind of comes into play when we talk about executing segregation of duty risk assessments. That comes back into the role kind of conversation I was saying, where you want to do an effective role analysis to see if you do have toxic combinations of permissions. You've got to be able to show the risks that are currently in your organization, and you've got to go do the best you can do to start remediating those risks, cleaning up the organization to a certain is what I guess what I'm getting at. You want to get clean. Next, You want to stay clean. So this is where the implementation of all the policies and practices I've been talking about really comes into play. You want to implement things like access request workflows. You want to automate this stuff because it's going to make your life easier. But the automation is key, but what's even more key is introducing things like predictive risk around access requests. Being able to surface the risk associated with a request to an approver so that approver can make an informed decision as far as whether that user should get that access or not. You've got to put a good, effective access certification program in place. I mean, every organization is having to do access reviews now. Most of them treat it as an annual pain in the butt for their auditors, but effectively, you've got to change that mentality. Access certifications have to be done more frequently, and it's got to be an ongoing process. So doing things like, if I change jobs within an organization, if my access request workflows are working right and effectively, that means I move to my new job. My old permissions and roles are taken away, and I'm only given the roles or permissions needed for my new job. Well, guess what? Maybe we want to put a step in place that says I'm going to run a quick certification, or certifications could be run for me, that's going to go to my manager, and that certification is going to show and validate that, yes, now I have my new role and I only have the permissions associated with that role, and that the previous access I had has gone away. So staying clean is not just doing the automated workflows and managing access accordingly, but it's also putting checks in place, things like access certifications that help validate that this stuff is done. You want to optimize. Once you stay clean, now's where the optimization really starts taking place. Role mining, role engineering. Well, I'm working with a lot of customers right now that are going through that exercise. What that really means is, they're up and running. They've got their base roles in place. They've done some cleanup of those roles, but now they want to get a lot more efficient with their roles and making sure that those roles are created accordingly and only have the permissions they need. So that becomes a whole exercise around role mining, role engineering, and there are platforms out there that can assist with that and do a great job using AI, machine learning, and so on to come up with an effective role framework for your organization. And then you want to implement license management. License management's key. Every organization has their own way of doing it. Some use spreadsheets and so on. But if you could somehow incorporate that into your, whatever you're using for your kind of identity management, that's going to make your life a lot easier. So again, get clean, stay clean, and then ongoing, you're going to just constantly be optimizing. All right, so let's talk real quick, and I probably should have this early in the presentation, but I do want to make this clear. Let's talk about the difference between separation of duties versus sensitive access. I think I've covered separation of duties quite heavily. You get that it's a toxic combination of permissions. So, for example, you'll see here, if I have the ability to create a sales order, chances are I shouldn't have the ability to create an invoice as well. That creates a toxic permission and allows me the potential for doing some very bad things within that organization. Now, when you're talking about access to our sensitive data, sensitive access, that's really about transactions or activities that are sensitive due to, the transaction allows access to financial or highly confidential information. Chances are those types of transactions should only be executed by select users or, highly experienced and knowledgeable. So again, difference between separation of duties versus sensitive data access. Both need to be monitored carefully. Separation of duties is something we've talked about, controls to be put in place around that. So even if you have to have them, they're usually temporary, and you can put things like time-bound access or other mitigating controls in place. Sensitive access, anybody making a request to do some kind of sensitive transaction or view some sensitive activity, it probably needs to go through an escalated approval process. I mean, it's not just something that should be given to somebody as a matter of course. It should be managed and controlled very stringently. All right, so what are some of the common pitfalls in implementing GRC platforms? Basically, and again, some of this is repeating what I said earlier, it's where you're not getting ample visibility into your segregation of duties and sensitive access exposure. You have a lack of super user monitoring. So we talked about the application owners that are typically treated like, the kings of the castle for that particular application. Well, who knows what that application owner is doing with those permissions. So you need to have monitoring across those types of accounts, across those types of activities. It's really key to bring those into your application access program. You really want to involve your auditors. I mean, as you develop a program around managing identity, managing GRC and stuff, you want to be in the loop with your auditors, both internal and external, so that they have the ability to review and kind of not second guess, but at least sign off on some of the things you're trying to do. And chances are they've seen a lot of it before and probably can offer some good guidance as well. Keep moving. So here's when you talk about comprehensive GRC approaches, that can include solutions, but it also includes processes and such as well. Automated lifecycle management, that's really key. We've talked about that. Trust security. So basically, we've talked about the principle of least privilege. Zero trust security is kind of an offshoot of that. Zero trust means I don't trust anybody, so that anybody has to jump through hurdles to get access, even potentially for what they need to do their daily jobs. So you want to try to but you want to try to strive for that concept of zero trust security. And there's a lot of documentation on how to approach that. Continuous compliance monitoring. Again, you're subject to potentially, depending on your industry, you're subject to various regulations. You want to do continuous compliance monitoring around that. There are platforms that offer tools and things that allow for the ongoing reporting against those types of regulations, whether it's SOC, HIPAA, ITSC, GDPR. You have to monitor according to those. Key benefits: significant time around provisioning. So automated provisioning done effectively can reduce a lot of time and cost. I can get my employees access to what they need to do their jobs sooner, as opposed to the way it's typically done today. Facilitating least privilege. We talked about least privilege. You've really got to work through your automation and your roles to kind of make sure that principle of least privilege is something you're striving for on a continuous basis. And basically, if you do it right, you're gonna see a major reduction in your audit cycles because everything's going to be there for your auditors. I mean, you'll be able to roll off reports. You're going to be able to show them automated processes that are being used. You're going to have logs to show that yes, this was done appropriately. This person only has the access they need, and so on. All right, before we get into questions, I do want to close with something else because there's another aspect of this that I think gets lost when we focus just on GRC. So I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts around how GRC and how it's addressed these days. And quite frankly, GRC isn't the panacea that many organizations assume it is in their security programs. I mean, first, what's an audit? An audit really isn't a report of something at a point in time. My auditor issues a report that says I have all the necessary GRC controls in place as of December 31st. I must be good. But what if something in my organization changes on January 1st? Something in one of my key applications. Maybe I introduced a new SaaS app into my portfolio. What if something's changed in one of my critical business processes? Maybe I have a new role that I misdesigned and maybe it has some questionable permission combinations across my key systems. Am I going to have to wait till next December 31st to have this surfaced as a risk? In a typical GRC world, that may be the situation you're in. So I want to introduce and close out with this one more acronym, ERM, Enterprise Risk Management. An effective ERM approach really can provide that assurance that governance, risk, and compliance management is being maintained in an ongoing and timely manner. I could go into more detail on this, but I mean, I highly recommend researching the recent downfall of Silicon Valley Bank as a textbook example of ERM failure, where the ongoing controls were not in place and certain people within the organization were able to abuse access across the organization. Look at Theranos. That's that innovative healthcare technology company that was exposed as having, technology that basically didn't work. Then you got Wirecard. It's one word, Wirecard. It's an electronics payment firm in Munich, Germany. Faced the biggest corporate fraud case in German history in 2022. Very interesting case study. And then Luckin Coffee, China-based company. that was really got hung up in a legal quagmire stemming from fake revenue scandal. All these things would have been at least mitigated and alleviated if they'd had an effective GRC type program in place. But even more importantly, if they had a ongoing risk management program to kind of handle that stuff between audits. I mean, GRC and ERM must work seamlessly together to prevent these types of incidents. So, Kira, I haven't had a look at questions, but
yes, we do have a lot of questions. I'll jump right in for you. Do GRC requirements change based on industry?
Yes, it comes down to that aspect of compliance. Every organization may be subject to different compliance mandates. If I'm a healthcare company, I'm subject to HIPAA. HIPAA drives a lot of kind of controls and frameworks that have to be put in place in an organization around the protection of PHI. If I do credit cards, I mean, I've got a bunch of PCI controls that I have to put in place, and those all fall under that GRC umbrella.
Where does CMMI fit in the process to assist in doing gap analysis?
CMMI, yeah, I'm not as intimately familiar. I've got customers that are CMMI rated. I know they're trying to get to the higher rating, and I can't even tell you what that scale looks like. But CMMI is a set of practices that represent a very good set of controls that form the basis of things like I think NIST, ITSC, a lot of those frameworks kind of evolved from CMMI to a certain extent. So I would say CMMI is a great starting point to look at in terms of general security controls.
In managing GRC in multiple geographical areas and the IT finance low budget mindset, how can you convince traditional leaders to invest in a GRC platform or approach? I take them the case studies. Here's what happens if you don't. Here's where abuses can happen. But even aside from that, I would say just if you bring along in that approach the automation aspects of stuff we talked about, lifecycle management around users, it's not just a cautionary tale around preventing bad things from happening, but it also results in a real ROI across the organization based on the savings that you can accomplish. I would just say we do a lot of ROI analyses for customers that, again, don't just focus on the bad things that could happen, but also focused on the savings you could realize. Should risk management programs use a centralized third-party vendor to manage cross-application SOD, or is the risk too high that it will be used as a substitute for intentional governance?
That's an interesting question. So if we're talking about platforms or tools that can surface SODs across applications, I don't think you need to spread that out. If you find an effective platform that does that for you, I think you could rely on that as long as the appropriate controls are in place and appropriate reporting is. I don't think you run the risk that where you would have to spread that out, because all you're expecting from those tools is to surface those risks, report on those risks, and then it's doing its job. And the people that come in and do the mitigation and remediation can do their jobs. But yeah, I don't think spreading that amongst multiple platforms or processes is really required.
What training resources, either from ISACA or external sites, would you recommend to help implement an effective GRC program? Do you have any recommendations for tools or templates that can be used for GRC?
There's a lot out there. I apologize. I wish I'd known this was coming ahead of time. I would have gotten a list of them. There are a lot of training resources. I would just go and search for GRC. A lot of the big 5 accounting firms, for example, have a lot of training type of materials as well for their customers and prospects. There's just a lot of them out there, and you'll recognize a lot of the names that are presenting them.
How would a dedicated GRC audit differ from other internal audits or external SOC Type 2 audits?
It would be very similar. You think of the GRC audit as being kind of all-encompassing, because when you talk about SOC and stuff like that, I mean, that's going to be covering a lot of the same GRC stuff as well. So when I say GRC audits, those all those different audit types. So an internal audit typically focuses on this as well, but a SOC audit, that's a component of GRC. A PCI audit, that's a component typically of GRC. So it's not as though a GRC audit is necessarily a separate entity in itself. It's just now it's being held at the forefront around most audits. So in other words, when you used to do SOX audits and things like that, it was very focused on SOX controls. And did you meet those? Check. If you did, check that box. When you take a more GRC focused approach, you're not just looking at, checking boxes. You're also looking at what ongoing processes and such like that as well.
Comment and question here. The hard part of cross-app SOD and least privilege is defining what that means in your business context, per user role, per application. Do the out-of-box rules you mentioned cover most areas of SOD conflicts, or do you still have to do your own work?
Yeah, okay. So let's take that in a couple of different ways. So for an application like SAP, Oracle, and so on, yes, there are out-of-the-box rule sets that come into play. That can be used. It's a good starting point, but I will tell you that every organization typically kind of makes their own role framework, where maybe they're creating new roles within SAP, they're creating new roles within Oracle, they're combining roles in SAP to create, kind of a larger scale role. But so you're going to want to be able to modify those rule sets to accommodate your growth. The other aspect is there are a lot of applications where an out-of-the-box rule set isn't really going to work. I mean, let's take Active Directory. Active Directory, every organization has its own way of using Active Directory, how they're creating groups, what those groups are used for. So you're not going to be able to find an out-of-the-box rule set that's going to fit every organization. In that instance, you are looking at maybe taking a template and then modifying that rule set to adhere to your particular your Active Directory group framework, for example.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question. What are the key challenges organizations face in securing application access, and how does implementing a GRC solution address those challenges?
Securing access, there are a host of the challenges organizations face. Usually provisioning and such is historically it's done, via email from a manager, and then that application owner goes in and assigns access. Do they get it right? Do they assign the right roles, right permissions? Do they over-assign? There's just no account. In a lot of places, there's no accountability for what that user has in that application. And that extends across the enterprise. So that's one of the biggest challenges that you're faced unless you have some kind of GRC type program. And it's not just GRC. Let's put it in a larger bucket. It's all around identity management, identity governance, and administration. That handles all that. GRC is a component of it, but you really need not just the controls around GRC, but also just the controls around automation, the controls around access reviews and such that come typically with an IGA platform. That's why I love the business I'm in, because IGA is so huge right now. Organizations are starting to recognize they can't get away with managing identities in a spreadsheet or managing identities in Active Directory. They've got to have some centralized platform to manage the automation of those user life cycles and such. So I just say it's all about IGA.
Excellent. Well, we want to thank you, JD, for a great presentation and Q&A sessions. Lots of wonderful questions from our audience. We appreciate you as well. A special thank you to our sponsor, Savient, as well, for sponsoring this session. If you watch the required 50 minutes, your CPE certificate will automatically appear in the ISACA CPE record section of your ISACA account. It can take up to 48 hours for the CPE credit and certificate to be added to your CPE manager. This webinar was recorded and will be available on demand within 48 hours. Please locate the on-demand recording from the virtual events section of your classroom within the ISACA Learning Access page. This webinar and the information contained in it are not intended to or intended for distribution or use by any person. Again, we want to thank our speaker for his time, expertise, and great information today. To everyone who was able to join us live and will join on demand, thank you for your attention and participation, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, JD. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.